So I actually get quite a lot of questions about how I weathered this. This is my Imperial Workshop arc. I bought this on Facebook Marketplace. I really liked Lightsaber, but I wasn't quite a fan of the finish. And I kind of knew that going into it. I kind of planned on weathering this. Made a quick little video about weathering it, and I get tons of questions about how I did that. So I figured I'd just make a video about how I'm going to weather my Imperial Workshop Vega. When I weather lightsaber hilts, I use sanding pads and steel wool. I use sanding pads instead of sanding paper because when you use sanding paper, where you are pressing with your finger, it really sands that part more than anything else. So it's a little bit harder to get an overall smooth finish when you're trying to sand a round surface. When you use a sanding pad, when you press down, it kind of sands everything that the sanding pad is touching evenly. I use 4-0 steel wool. I'm only going to be using this towards the end of the video. This is really just to clean up the saber towards the end of the entire process. You're going to get some really, not super deep, but kind of deep marks from the sanding pad, and this kind of just smoothens those out so you don't feel it as much. It also helps get an overall smooth finish on all parts of the lightsaber, whether it's on the metal parts or the black painted parts. And the edges of the lightsaber by the emitter or by the pommel that have really kind of more sharp edges, it's going to just kind of help round out that edge a little bit more. I am going for a light weather on this hilt. On my arc, I went for what I would consider a medium weather. On this one, I wanted to do something a little bit more conservative and not go too over the top. I can always change this down the road if I decide to make it more weathered, but for now I wanted to do a light weathering. So I'm going to be leaving most of the black in place, but I want to get all of the edges where the black is, where you're going to see kind of by the switch where the hilt will be flat and then it makes a 90-degree turn and then another 90-degree turn. I'm going to be trying making those sharp 90-degree turns a little bit more worn down there, as if this has been thrown in the sand or in and out of pockets or backpacks or whatever it is that would wear down those edges over time. I'm also not going to be making the entire lightsaber, the black area's lightsaber, all the same level of worn down. I want it to be worn down more in some areas than others, and in some parts of it I want the black to almost be still completely just black, with maybe just the top coat of the paint worn off, so it's kind of lost some of its shine, but it is still completely black in some areas. Some of these deep recessed areas in the hilt are really hard to get the sanding pad into. If you want, you can use sanding paper here because sanding paper is a little bit more precise. You can actually fold the sanding paper in half, and then that folded point, you can actually kind of get into those deep recessed areas. It will take a very long time to fully get that top layer of the black off with this method, but it is a way to get into those deep recessed areas if you are having trouble getting into those with the sanding pad. Because I am going for a light weathering on this one, I don't care too much about sanding those deep recessed areas. On some of the wider ones, I do want to kind of remove the black finish a little bit, get rid of that shine to it. So I will be weathering it a little bit with the sanding pad, but I'm not too concerned about getting to the bare metal in those areas. You'll probably notice I'm also not spending too much time on each individual area at the moment. I try to weather the hilt relatively evenly all the way around. I'll pick one area, I'll get that to a good starting point, I'll move on to the next area, get that to a good starting point, move on, and once I've got the entire hilt kind of generally weathered, I will then go back to different areas and weather it a little bit more according to how I want. It's a little bit easier to gauge how much you want to do when the entire thing is got a slight weather to it. If you focus all your attention on one area and get that exactly how you think you want it, and then you weather the rest of it, it's very easy to over weather the areas before realizing it. But when you kind of do the entire thing in stages, it's a little bit easier to gauge how far down you want to go through the paint. And in case you're wondering why I have a paper towel underneath the hilt and I have another one off to the side that I keep using to kind of like brush it off, all the chunks or little particles and dust of the paint and the finish that I am sanding off does build up relatively quick, and it just makes it really messy to leave all of that on there and just keep sanding through it. So it's easier for me to just kind of periodically get the dust and whatever particles I am picking up off of it. Anything that falls down on the table, it just falls onto the paper. It's just easier to keep it clean, and it just looks a little bit more precise. If you leave all of that paint particles on there, it gets a really dirty kind of look to it while you're doing it, and it's kind of hard to tell how far down you've gone, so it just helps gauge it a little bit better. You may also notice that I am sanding in one direction and then straight back. I'm not doing any circular motions, and I'm not going up and down and then left and right. It gives it a much more brushed aluminum look if you're just going one direction and then right back. You can kind of pick which direction that is that you want, but if you sand it in circles, you kind of just take off the paint and you'll put in little swirl marks. Same thing with the aluminum or the steel or whichever hilt it is that you have. You'll put swirl marks in it, and you can make it a little bit more uneven. If that's the look you are going for, that's by all means acceptable. It's up to you. You can weather it however you weather it, but I weather it going straight forward and then straight back just to keep that nice clean brushed look. It's just the style that I prefer. So when I start sanding the pommel, I quickly noticed that it was really hard for me to sand the pommel without going up and down from the bottom of the hilt to the top of the hilt, which is not the pattern that I wanted to do. So it was easier for me to just take the pommel off, weather the pommel by itself. That way I wasn't also getting a little bit of my strokes onto the hilt. I want the hilt just going, the brush strokes just going left to right. If you do get some going in an opposite direction of what you want, for instance, I'm going left to right, and if you want it going left to right and you get some that go up and down, just sand over that for a little bit, and you can relatively easily get rid of the brush strokes that you don't want. But I figured instead of making more work for myself and needing to sand through those, it's better to just take the pommel off, sand the pommel by itself, put the pommel back on, and then go back to the hilt. Up until this point, I've also only been focusing on the black parts of the hilt. I'm still what I would consider relatively in the first stage. I'm just getting the black parts to a nice even weather, all from the bottom of the pommel all the way to the top of the emitter, and then from here I will then go back to specific areas that I want weathered a little bit deeper and go down that way. This kind of just goes back to not focusing too much on one area at first. Once you have the entire thing finished with like a nice starting weather, it's easier to pinpoint specific areas. And then once I'm done weathering the black, then I'm gonna go and move on to the brushed aluminum look that I'm going for. I did also mention that I don't do circular motions for the way I'm trying to weather this. The one exception to that is the very bottom of the pommel, because it is one round object. Basically it's a flat disc. It just looks a little bit better to completely do a circular motion right there. If you're moving from one end to the other, those lines aren't always going to line up with the hilt going straight up and down or left and right. So on this one, it's easier to kind of do its own separate thing, but only on that very bottom flat area. But again, when you weather it, you can kind of pick however you want to do it. At this point, I'm just about done getting all of the black areas to a nice starting level of weathering. From here, I'm going to go back and find specific areas that I want a little bit more weathered, and then kind of weather it appropriate to what I want. I am kind of doing targeted areas around the switch. I have one to the bottom right of the switch that I kind of want to give a little bit more of a deep worn area, kind of somewhere as if where your thumb would be, very frequently sliding from one side and then sliding over to turn it on or turn it off. And then to the top left of the switch, there is another area that I'm kind of doing a little bit deeper right there as well. Kind of, to me personally, when I spin my lightsabers, that little spot right there is kind of where my thumb tends to rest. So I kind of tend to choke up a little bit on the hilt, just a little bit, and a little bit over to the side. So those are the two areas for me specifically where my thumb kind of tends to rest the most. So that's kind of why I figured those two areas is where I'm going to weather it just a little bit more. On a completely unrelated side note, as I'm editing this video, I'm realizing that the light from my computer screen is kind of shining some cool colors onto my hilt. It's completely unintentional, and just when I'm looking back at this edit right now, I keep seeing like pink and green and blue just shining onto my hilt. Just gives it kind of a cool sci-fi effect. From here forward, I'm starting to get pretty happy with the general worn down level on the black, so I'm going to be moving forward to the polished parts of the hilt. I'm not quite sure if this is a polished aluminum, which I believe it is on this hilt. Regardless of whatever it is that they actually made it out of, I'm just trying to kind of get rid of that polish, so I'm using the sanding pad going left and then right, left and then right. I forgot to mention as well that I am using a relatively strong grit sanding pad. I believe this was 40 grit, if I remember correctly. It is a relatively strong grit, so for some of the polished areas like this, you really don't even need to apply that much pressure. Just a relatively decent amount of pressure, and you're very quickly going to be scratching up that polish and getting down into it. And if you keep going left and then right, or if you choose up and then down, very quickly you're going to get that brushed look. This does, again though, go back to what I was saying about why I don't do circular motions here. If you do circular motions, you don't really get that brushed look. You don't really see like little micro individual lines. It's more of just the entire thing has some swirls in it and is a little bit more kind of muddy looking, is the best way I can think of to describe it. But I just go all the way from the top of the emitter all the way down to the pommel, and I'm going to get that nice brushed look, which I will then come back later and clean with the sanding, or not the sanding pad, but the steel wool. For the steel wool, the majority of the hilt, I just wrap around with the steel wool around the hilt inside of my hand, just kind of grip down on it to apply some pressure, and then with my other hand I just spin the hilt. That's the best and easiest way I found to basically kind of clean up the hilt, get rid of some of the deeper marks, get rid of some of the harsher edges, and it also does a little bit more weathering on top of that. But on the tip where the emitter is, because the shape of my emitter, I can't really wrap around it, so on that part I do kind of need to kind of spot check, do it a little bit more precise with fingers as opposed to just wrapping it. Same thing with the pommel. The bottom of the pommel has these small little, almost kind of like studs that poke out a little bit, that you can't really wrap around it, so I just kind of like I would with the sanding pad, just go left and right with that. It's pretty easy to figure out how to work around those areas though. And with that, that's really everything that goes into doing a weathering like this on one of my hilts. You will definitely want to remember to clean up the area that you're working in. There is going to be a rather large amount of paint particles and small little chunks of metal from the steel wool or something that you're knocking off from the hilt. So just make sure to clean up your area. But with that, that's really the end of weathering one of my hilts. Alright, so my Vega's done, and that's really how I weather it. It's not a whole lot of hard work to it. It does take some time, but it's not super hard work. I'm actually really happy with how this one came out. I was just trying to go for a light weathering. I kind of wanted to get the polished look kind of more brushed, and I wanted the black to be a little bit more kind of like worn down in some areas, and then the edges to be a little bit more worn down on the edges. And the pommel, I'm actually really happy with how the pommel came out. And yeah, that's really it. It's not that hard to do. There's not too much work to it. Like I said, it just does take some time, especially on the black on these. I haven't weathered something other than an Imperial Worlshop yet, so I'm not quite sure what the finish is like on those. But the black on these does take quite a decent amount of time to get through that top coat and actually start getting into the metal. On the edges, it's not so bad, but when you have the more flat surfaces, it does take a little bit of time to get through that. But once you get through that, you can very easily go too far, and then you just have metal. So that's kind of why I wanted to do a light weathering on this one. My arc, I feel, is a little bit more of a medium weathering, is what I would call it. This one's more of a light weathering, and I can always weather it more down the road if I want to. But I'm really happy with how this came out. I'm really happy with how the polished look is more of a brushed look now. Not too sure how well that brushed look is going to be coming off in the camera, but if you want to see what it looks like yourself, you can always do it to your own lightsaber and then see what you think. I'm really happy with it though. But with that, peace.